Mark Batterson originally wrote this as a devotion, but the information contained at the beginning is important, especially if we hadn't heard of the term seeding the clouds. November 13th, 1946. I was but a wee lad. No. That's how long ago it was, 1946. A plane took off from the Schenectady County Airport with a rather unique payload, 6 pounds of dry ice. Its mission? To seed the clouds with solidified carbon dioxide in hopes of creating enough condensation to cause precipitation. Upon takeoff, Schaefer flew his single-prop plane into a cumulus cloud and dumped the dry ice. Eyewitnesses on the ground said that the clouds seemed to explode. The subsequent snowfall was visible for 40 miles. The GE monogram had a little fun with Schaefer's breakthrough. Schaefer made it snow this afternoon in Pittsfield. Next week he walks on water. Didn't happen. The science of seeding clouds may be a modern-day marvel, but the idea is as old as the prophet Elijah. After a famine that lasted 3.5 years, Elijah seeded the clouds with a brave prayer. You know this story of Elijah? He'd been hiding in the desert for 3 years, not sure what to do. The nation was under a severe drought for those 3 years, but Elijah had enough faith. Here we go. Elijah had enough faith to climb the mountain and before all the people promised them that rain would fall. Now, how many of us are confident enough, faithful enough, that after 3 years of something not working, we would stand up in front of everybody and say, it's going to happen tomorrow? Would you do that? Would you be that confident? Have you been in situations where for 3 years or 3 months or 3 days you've agonized over something, you've worried about something, you've wanted an answer, and there's been a drought for 3 years or 3 months or 3 days? Things that you've lost countless nights' sleep over. I know I shared with you in the past the story of Brady and those things that we went through, and some of you came up to me later that day and said, oh, thank you, I've had something similar. I was afraid I was the only one. Or I think one person said, if we combined all of the resources that we spent on these little projects that we didn't know how they were going to come out, we could do great things. And we do, we wait. We wait and wait and wait, and then we have the confidence to stand up and say, it's over. Do we? Elijah did. Here's the story of Elijah. Elijah climbed back up to the top of the mountain and began to pray again. He asked God for rain. This is in Judges. He had told King Ahab that there would be heavy rain. Not just rain, heavy rain. And in faith, Elijah could hear the rain coming. But even with the promise from God of rain, Elijah still prayed. He continued his actions in faith that God would answer his prayer. He sent his servant to go toward the sea, but the servant returned without seeing any indication of rain. Elijah repeated this exercise 7 times, and he continued to wait on God. Finally, the 7th time, the servant returned with news that there was a small cloud coming up from the sea. Elijah sent the servant to the king and told him to hitch his chariot and hurry down the mountain before the rain came. For 3 years, the land had been in a severe drought as a direct result of the people turning away from God. They had been waiting for the rain, but at this moment, Elijah had faith to hear the rain coming. He knew the rain had been withheld because of the people's path away from God, and now that they had returned to God, the rain would return. Elijah had faith to send his servant to the sea 7 times to keep looking for the rain cloud. You remember how many times the boy cried wolf before the people gave up on him? Yeah. 4 times longer than that, this servant is sent to the sea. And I'm sure were I the servant at that time, I would be riding the chariot down to the sea to look for rain, and I would be mumbling something under my breath that was not very nice about Elijah. Then when the tiniest cloud appeared on the horizon, he knew that there was heavy rain coming, and coming quickly. The time of waiting on God for the rain had come at last. Mark Batterson tells us about seeding the cloud back in 1946. And if you don't know about the science of this, here's what it is. Here's what happens. So all of these tiny water vapor molecules that form these clouds that we can see even today, all of those little tiny vapors are all just hanging out by themselves. There's no leader or organization or somebody like Nita saying, okay, we're going to do this now, we're going to move those chairs and tables. There's nothing for these little bitty individual droplets to do until they're introduced to something that they can see, something that they can feel, something that they can cling to. So with this frozen CO2, dry ice, scattered out, there are now all of these particles that are floating around in this cloud, and the water droplets say, aha, something to cling to, something to cling to, something to cling to, and it gets bigger and bigger until it falls as precipitation. They've seeded clouds with dust. They've seeded clouds with, one report they used a flare gun, fired the flare up into the clouds, so that when it burst, there were all of these particles for the water droplets, the water vapor droplets, to finally cling to. How many of you know about pearls? Nobody knows about pearls. Okay, so it's the, yeah, you do. It's that little round, beautiful thing that's inside of an oyster, a pearl-producing oyster. And do you know what starts that pearl? Have you heard this?
A grain of sand?
It's a grain of sand or some other irritant that gets in, and the pearl and the oyster, as a defense mechanism, starts secreting this nacre around this irritant until it's protected from the irritant. And it keeps secreting over and over and over and over and over again. More than one layer, more than 2 layers, thousands of layers of this stuff. Things don't just happen the first time. Sometimes we have to keep on going. So when Paul wrote the letter to the church in Corinth, he describes this incredible importance of sowing generously. The more you sow, the more you reap. The more you will see some of the seed come out as the fruit of your labor. Can we apply that to other things in our lives? Can we sow good deeds? Can we sow good thoughts? Can we sow smiles? If we're generous with the healthy habits that we form, those things that make us who we are, those things that have gotten us to this point in our lives, if we're generous in sharing those things, healthy fruits will develop from that as a result. So we began talking about all of the habits that Batterson said. The first one, flip the script. Rewrite the story to be the ending that God has for you. Kiss the wave. You remember that one? Kiss the wave that sends you up against the rock of ages. Take those blessings that are disguised as hurts and fears and worries and realize that they're from God. Eat the frog. That was one of my favorites. If you've got something you got to do it first thing and get it over with. If you have to eat a frog, eat it right off in the morning. Fly the kite. You remember the boy that flew the kite over the Niagara River, and then they attached a longer thread and a longer thread and a rope and a steel cable and eventually a bridge from the little idea of flying the kite. Cut the rope. This was where the guy stood up on the elevator brake demonstration at the World's Fair and cut the rope and plummeted until he applied the brake. And now everybody who gets in an elevator and starts to push a button sees the man's name, Otis. Elevator right there at the top. Wind the clock. Be very, very conscious of the time we have, the moments we have, and how do we fill those up. How many of you have an index card on your refrigerator now? Did some of you do that? 500, 25,600 minutes. Yeah, Susan did. Mark's got one. I challenge you to think about how, Lucille's remembering where she put it. I challenge you to think about all of the moments that we're given in life and how we fill them up. So today we want to talk about taking all of those blessings and planting some seeds for the future. Have any of you planted something that will outlive you? Put a tree in the ground that will probably outlive you? You know, you don't always do things for your own immediate benefit, do we? The decisions you make today will give you the results you will experience tomorrow. The risks you take, the habits you form, the actions you produce, the mindfulness of the time that you create, it all contributes to the outcome that you experience later in life. The best way to see the cloud is through prayer. Elijah went up and prayed 7 times. He knew in his heart, he knew in his mind, he knew in his faith that the rains were coming. God had taught him and told him. God says there will be rain. There's not much else I can do about it, right? But what did Elijah do? 7 times went up and prayed. We often, in our prayers, ask for the desire of God's heart. We want to do what God desires. Yeah? If you break desire down, you get desire. Day is almost always where something's from or what something's of. Right? Cruella de Vil was Cruella from the village. Desire. Sire is father. Your desire are the things of or from the Father. When you pray for the desire of God, you're praying for God's will. As Christians, it's our responsibility to plant those seeds of faith through hope and prayer. And then we need to water what we see and grow it into what we envision for the future. If you plant carrot seeds, what will you get? Hopefully carrots. This is really easy. Blurt them out if you know the answers. If you plant tomato seeds, you'll get tomatoes, right? What if you plant nothing? What will you get? Nothing. You get what you plant. The actions you sow today produce the answers and results you will experience tomorrow. I was going to wow you with my technology, and I had practiced at home, and that little thing that I took away was my Hey Google. Do you have one? Or it's Alexis or Siri or any of those computer know-it-alls, right? So I asked Google this morning, I said, hey Google, how many references are there in the Bible about money? And I was going to show you that. I'm so proud. Over 2,000. Over 2,000. Hey Google, how many references are there about worry? 365. One for every day. And then I got to thinking, why are there more references about money than there are about worry? What is that telling us? We should care about money, or we should handle money responsibly as we store up our treasures on earth, so we store them up in heaven. About, 7 or 8 years ago, Jill and I took a course called Crown Financial. It was a Dave Ramsey course. Some of you may have heard of it. It's all based on the biblical aspect of what we're given, what we give, how we use those gifts, how we increase those gifts, and the final outcome of all of that is so that we may bring the kingdom of heaven to earth, that we will prosper so that we will use those gifts to further God's kingdom, to create it here on earth. Once I started looking at money in that way, that it wasn't a tool just to be fed or just to show wealth or just to make my life easier, but as a tool for how can we advance God's kingdom? What could I do if money was no object? How would I serve the Lord if that were the case? So does it make sense to invest pennies today for riches tomorrow? Does it make sense to have a layer of nacre over an irritant to protect us? Does it make sense for small, teeny tiny, insignificant particles to attract water vapor molecules to create rain? Does it make sense for a small habit today of waking up, putting your feet on the ground, on the side of your bed and saying, thank you, God, for going over and over and over and over again? Because that's what it takes. Elijah knew that. The Apostle Paul knew that. Continue to do these things. Continue to sow seeds. Continue to sow seeds of love. Because it gets down to this, doesn't it? What are we about? What are we? What do I want? No, want is not the right word. What would make my heart leap with joy if I heard somebody say something at my funeral? What would make my heart leap with joy? He drove a nice car. They took some pretty cool trips. Yeah, maybe I did, and maybe that helped me become who I am. But what I really hope is that, hey, I remember Mr. Jeude as my 5th grade teacher, and the time that I didn't have my homework finished, and he didn't yell at me, but he took me out in the hallway to help me get started on it, and he noticed me crying, and he bent down, even though he had a hard time getting up off the floor with his weight and age and bad knees. He bent down and he talked with me, and he made me feel better about myself. I didn't teach that kid grammar that day. I didn't teach that kid punctuation that day. I taught that kid that the greatest thing you can do is just be there for somebody. Right? Last week we talked about that dash between the years that are written on our tombstones, the date of our birth, the date of our death, and that little dash in between that encapsulates everything there is about our life. Some of the things are so small and so insignificant that they lead to the growth of larger things. I pray today that you have the strength and the courage and the conviction of Elijah, that you have the faith the size of a what? Mustard seed? Not a huge boulder. A mustard seed is good enough. I pray that you can wrap whatever irritates you into something beautiful and make something beautiful out of it. Just like the oyster does with that pearl, with that grain of sand. I challenge you to look up to the heavens, to the clouds, and say, oh, I see you up there. I know that you have great potential. But maybe today, you're just going to shade the chair where I'm going to sit outside when the sun is glinting off the water, throwing it right back in my face, and I feel so totally alive. Let's not give up on our hopes. Let's not give up on our dreams. Let's not give up on those things which we've started doing in our lives that we know will produce the fruit of the Spirit. We know that we'll produce the love of God. We know that we'll produce love with our fellow man. We need to keep doing those things. We need to seed the clouds. We need to be an oyster and a pearl. We need to pray on a mountain. There's a push, do you know push prayer? I bet Nita knows push prayer. Nita, what's frog? Frog.
What?
Frog.
Fully rely on God.
Fully rely on God. There's a little frog over by the candles, and I thought it was the craziest thing until Nita told me why it was there. Push prayer is pray until something happens. You may know it's going to happen, but don't stop your prayers. Keep on going until that thing is revealed. Because that's the desire of God's heart, that you commit yourself to things that bring God glory, that bring out the beauty of God, that bring out the love of God. Those little bitty things. Don't give up. I wish I were a better encourager. I'm not. I rely on my wife Jill for that. I give up way too easily, and she's my encourager. She's my little sand in an oyster. That little irritant that says, you can do better, and I wrap it in beauty, and then she says, you can do better, and we need those things in our lives. God is giving us that. There's no better time than right now to plant the seeds that will be our future.